And then the Israel BDS movement that we've been building is having some important positive impacts. Of course, the biggest thing is to get our countries to stop sending, in our case, coal and probably bullets. We haven't confirmed it very well, but the difference that I would have with some of the people who promote BRICS as a strategic anti-imperial force, I would say no. If I look at it adding accumulation processes and social struggles, which they don't often, then I would say, okay, this is not anti-imperial, it's sub-imperial because they're fitting into the broader system and they're actually in many ways amplifying.
Are we lost in our own heads thinking about Marx and thinking about global capital and all these things? It seems the global state of the psychological response to Israel is at a tipping point of like, we're tired of talk. We don't care how many speeches we give. We don't care how many condemnations you give. We want you to fucking do something. I'm Jay Shapiro, this is Dilemma, and these are some before thoughts I have before my conversation with Patrick Bond. Let me take you to the year 1955, and the Bandung Conference is getting underway in Indonesia in April. The Bandung Conference, this is, we're 10 years removed from the end of World War II, and the world has entered this decade of various fights for independence in, of course, the newly formed United Nations, political independence, and maybe sensing and seeing the two main powers that are left standing after World War II, with the United States, of course, and then the Soviet bloc. And Bandung gets together without either of them. And it's 29 newly independent Asian and African states. And they sort of at this conference declare or announce or invoke maybe a direction outside the path of US-led capitalist bloc in the West, of course, and then the Soviet sphere. This was sort of the birth of the non-alignment movement. It was the first large-scale meeting of the Global South, shaped by anti-colonial solidarity and a determination to resist Western domination. So this is leaders like Nehru and Sukarno, Nasser, many more. Speaking of racial equality, sovereignty, and building a new internationalism rooted in decolonization, even though they disagreed wildly about religion and politics of communism and non-communism and everything else. But there was maybe the spirit of third worldism was sort of envisioned here, led not by empire, but by a majority of humanity, which was who had lived under it. So former guests like Vijay Prashad point to Bandung 1955 and wonder or sense, and I think rightfully sense, that there is a sort of echo happening now, a reinvigoration of the spirit of Bandung of 1955, of wanting something different, wanting something non-aligned. But the question is BRICS a good representation of that echo, or is it a distraction, or is it just more of the same? Patrick Bond is excellent taking on that question, and I think being very fair with it. So let me just introduce you to Patrick Bond, and he's got an amazing bio. So he's a political economist, professor at University of Johannesburg, one of South Africa's leading voices on global justice. He trained under David Harvey and Edward Herman, which he'll mention. He worked in President Nelson Mandela's office, drafting early post-apartheid policy before becoming a fierce critic of the neoliberal compromises in South Africa's transition. Much of that is written in his book, Elite Transition. He's also written other books like Looting Africa. His research spans climate justice, debt crisis, geopolitics of BRICS, and much, much more. So I loved talking to Patrick Bond. And then I'm just going to mention before I jump into it that I think I've really overlooked, I'm ashamed to say, South African history as such a rich, awful stories there, but a rich ground to research and study to understand a lot of lessons that we can pull from it for making change. And then I'll also say, just with that, it's possible you'll hear Patrick Bond, as a South African who was on the front line of a lot of these fights, potentially, I think, overestimate the effectiveness of a BDS movement. Maybe. I'll talk about this in the afterthoughts too. Because it seemingly worked so well in a place like South Africa and was such a major hammer in that nail to bring down apartheid. I have some thoughts about that in the after, but he might be totally right there, and it's really, really important to listen and understand these stories and these histories. South Africa has so much more that I need to learn about, including, of course, I think something that many of us know of the very sordid relationship between Israel and Zionism and the apartheid regime, including sharing nuclear testing and all kinds of weapons and awful, awful, awful things. A lot of people know a lot about that. Anthony Lowenstein has written a lot about that in the Palestine Laboratory, and others have as well. So I'm going to get to the conversation right now with Patrick Bond, which I just absolutely loved. It's about BRICS, climate justice, Gaza, and much, much more. Enjoy, me and Patrick Bond. Yeah, why don't you start by introducing a little bit of your background and how you came to these questions generally? I've now digested and read a lot of your work, and so how did you come to these questions?
The bigger terrain that we all had to operate on, especially since the 1980s, if you were, as I was, sort of trained in U.S. left intelligentsia, my PhD supervisor, David Harvey, before that at the University of Pennsylvania, at the Wharton School, where Trump and Musk went. I was at Wharton, and Edward S. Herman, who with Chomsky wrote Manufacturing Consent. And before that, I did an undergrad in economics at Swarthmore College, where I was introduced to Marxian economics. You needed to find something concrete to run these lines of argument through. And for me, in the 80s, it was anti-apartheid. And we had a lot of our own family connections in this region, especially to Zimbabwe. So I did a PhD about Zimbabwe and its uneven development that was amplified by financial sector extremes that in turn reflected an underlying capitalist crisis tendency. And that was my fascination, partly with the logic of capital, and then increasingly, as you kind of work in a place like Southern Africa, the obvious question of colonialism and racism that's so durable, that exists in so many ways, that reproduces itself today. And then, because this is the region that, especially the city, where if I take 200-kilometer radius, half the world's historic gold was dug up from here. And the leader in the 20th century, the first half, Jan Smuts, was central to the way the Bretton Woods system was arranged, because at Fort Knox in Kentucky and here in Johannesburg was about half the world's gold each. And that meant, they had an interest in setting up world finance. So when you think about those ways that South Africa's freedom, I was lucky to work in President Mandela's office because I'd been out of various of the NGO and radical urban social movements here. I was parachuted into the presidency to be the first drafter of public policy because I could type quickly and had a good command of English. So that allowed me to see the transition unfold from the inside. And I wrote a book, Elite Transition, that spells out how compromises were made and the class formation, which has been so debilitating since then, that got underway. I worked at one point in the early 90s for Cyril Ramaphosa, indirectly in his Soweto, the Southwest Township Soweto scene, to try to promote free electricity, free water, as they were coming to grips with municipal democratization. But it was only when I wrote quite a few white papers of the policies for the new government that I could see how quickly the likes of Ramaphosa could be co-opted. He was extremely militant and very, very effective. Probably the smartest politician I've worked for, and that includes Mandela, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, and others at a very high level as a background technician, really. And then the co-optation process got me thinking that the future of this country could only be resolved, the contradictions addressed, through the huge wave of social movements emerging in the late 90s. And they were urban social movements, and they were single-issue social movements. So my biography, in a sense, only really begins when I understand the, let's say, struggle epistemologies, praxis, that is, people who create new understandings by fighting for their rights. And the most powerful was the Treatment Action Campaign, because they fought for the end of intellectual property, the most powerful part of capitalism in the past few decades, to be waived for AIDS medicines in the early 2000s, and they won. And I couldn't believe it, because it's embarrassing that many articles I wrote at the time were thinking that the balance of forces were so adverse. You had George W. Bush in the White House, but before that, Clinton, very neoliberal. And then you had Big Pharma Corp. And you had Bill Gates with his devotion to what we're both working on, I'm guessing, Microsoft platforms. So the intellectual property. And then we had an AIDS denialist as a president, Thabo Mbeki. And then you had about 1,000 activists, and they were dying very rapidly because not having access to these antiretroviral medicines that cost $10,000 a year, meant, it was a desperate and very, very debilitating situation that left us all depressed. This was 25 years ago, but they won. And I think in addition to the defeat of apartheid, the defeat of big pharmaceutical corporate power at that moment, by the way, a moment we saw 20 years afterwards in the early 2020s in the attempt to get COVID-19 vaccines and treatment out of that, sort of intellectual property grip at the World Trade Organization. The balance of forces had deteriorated so much that even if it was a global COVID pandemic, we couldn't win that. And it was that sense of that ascending corporate power and being quite involved with the global justice movement in the early 2000s before it sort of petered out. South Africa hosted a world conference against racism in Durban in 2001, which was spectacular in some ways by elevating the Palestinian cause, but also was the beginning of protest movements here against the regime in power, Mbeki. The next year, here in Johannesburg, Rio Plus 10, the environment conference, which thanks partly to a man, Dennis Brutus, who's probably known to some of your viewers as one of the greatest internationals. He passed away in 2009 at age 85, but he was really the greatest poet from South Africa. And he robbed an island, the prison in South Africa, with Nelson Mandela more or less next door, breaking stones. And thinking about revolution, Dennis then did get out and he went to first London, and then he started the anti-apartheid BDS applied to sports. And he was the most effective boycott, divestment, sanctions advocate. So he then brought that, of course, to his new friends, young friends in Palestine, people like Omar Barghouti, who could then learn those lessons of how BDS was part of the crucial role that the left internationalists played in getting rid of apartheid and hopefully getting rid of the genocide and the apartheid system in Israel. And all of those things come together in a place like this. Yeah, I hope you and your viewers will one day come and have a look, because our social struggles are quite intense, and we're very lucky just the background to serve them.
That was amazing. I mean, my response to all of that, just asking how you came to this, is I think I've greatly overlooked the cyclone of things in South Africa being quite the test ground for better or worse for a lot of these ideas that we're going to talk about. So you put a lot on the table that I'm going to piece through and go through, and there's a ton of half of what you said. Add more to the cyclone.
I'll have two little points about being in Joburg. It is the most unequal city in the world,
right?
According to the latest data we have on, it's called the Palma ratio. And secondly, PwC, a very corrupt consultancy. Those consultants have a economic crime and fraud survey that's like Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index, CPI. And South Africa doesn't do very well in the CPI. We rank 107th most corrupt out of 180, so we're mediocre. But for our corporates, world class, they have always ranked either number one or number two in PwC's corporate corruption index, which I completely trust, since it takes one to know one. PwC is very corrupt. They wrecked our national airline here, for example. So in any event, coming to Joburg, where extreme inequality and very sophisticated critical movements in labor, environment, youth, because we had a fees must fall that defeated the neoliberals in the Treasury, the finance ministry, over access to university education about 7 or 8 years ago. They have to keep renewing that struggle. And then in the communities, our urban social movements are among the world's finest. So we've got an extraordinary sight. Contradictions and misery and brutality. We don't have a white genocide. Afrikaner farmers are not being, all of that was total fiction. Afrikaner farmers the last couple of weeks have been really angry at Donald Trump because they put on tariffs on citrus and nuts and grapes and vineyards and things. So now actually there is some real pain amongst Afrikaners caused by Donald Trump and his tariffs. So a whole set of contradictions exist here.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, okay, so let's. I think I want to do an entire show on the thing you mentioned about the AIDS, the AIDS treatment, because that maybe we'll touch on some of it again. But let's shift a little. My main targets for this conversation. I just talked to Radhika Desai, your comrade and sometimes competitor in some of these intellectual thoughts. And I put this first question to her of sort of like, where are we now? And she launched into sort of hearing that as sort of, where are we now in the Marxist theory of capitalism's historical evolution or devolution or whatever. And I wonder how you answer it. And if you could, to just pick a few of the words you said in that opening sort of foray about neoliberalism, because I want to make sure that word gets defined. It's such a slippery one. I've used it maybe improperly or in different philosophical ways. But so where are we now generally in your view?
Okay, well, the theoretical framing, I don't probably have too many differences. I think there's a difference of emphasis. The crucial way one would look at capitalism, if you're trained as Radica was at Queen's with wonderful Marxists. I mean, Colin Lees is one example who I house sat for, and I was really proud to work with Colin, a Socialist Register editor, fantastic, clear Marxist who himself learned his social science by working in Kenya in the 50s. For me, David Harvey has a different emphasis, one unlike Radica, who has turned into really interstate rivalries as the core contribution she's making in the term geopolitical economy. We would say maybe two additional areas. And one is the logic of capital accumulation, and the other is the class struggle. And so if you do that sort of classical Marxism, you read from Das Kapital, you add the most crucial force, I think, in understanding imperialism, capitalism versus the non-capitalists. There we use Rosa Luxemburg, and she, in her 1910 book, advanced especially by reading about South Africa by John Hobson, who were great leftists here, Olive Schreiner, Pixley Kaseme. There were quite a few, let's say, contributors to the way people would understand the South African condition. Trotsky had some debates a few decades later, and by the 70s, we had a tradition called articulation of the modes of production, again, to say, well, how does capitalism, in this case, especially mining capitalism, how does it loot the non-capitalist? How does it do something that Karl Marx didn't do in Das Kapital, which is, for Marx, a relatively closed system where the logic is simply in the commodity production process, capital and labor. And then when crises emerge, crises of overproduction, then just like Radica said, you get a speeding up. She used the example of a tomato being produced, and then there being more technological advance in its production and distribution. And then the worker at the same time gets laid off because these advances usually imply labor-saving machinery or rising organic composition of capital. And that in turn makes the problem worse. The second thing that Marx talked about that I'm sure Radica could is speeding up, or he called it absolute surplus value extraction, as a response to these problems of overproduction, in which you just make your workers work harder. And that's the sort of sweatshop phenomenon that comes with neoliberalism, deregulation. Coming to neoliberalism in a minute, my supervisor, David Harvey, who has got a wonderful podcast, and people can learn Das Kapital through the davidharvey.org online website. The main thing, though, is he added to what Marx and Luxemburg had come up with through three other ideas. The first, drawing from Luxemburg, his most recent work this century, was accumulation by dispossession. That's basically capital resorting to stealing. And the way in which it does it, through privatizations, through the commodification of the air, for example, carbon markets, through land grabs, and through all the innovations now we're learning about through artificial intelligence. Those processes represent what I think Luxemburg could understand as that accumulation where capitalism meets the non-capitalist and, in her words, eats it up. The second and the third he developed in the early 80s. They're called the spatial fix, where capital moves around after it's got into an overproduction crisis. It's produced too much locally. It needs to move it out. And again, Radica described that very well. The third, the temporal fix, is when you use time. You can speed up a process to get more out of it, but particularly you let people consume now but pay later, and that's credit. So the financial system begins to bubble up, again, as a response to overproduction. So those three additions to Marx's relative and absolute surplus value, in other words, more machines and speeding up and sweatshops, So that Marx, described at the very core of his ideas. Luxemburg expanded it in the way that Radica described so wonderfully. Imperialism comes in, and capitalism needs imperialism. It's run out of space. But David does it by saying it's not just the geographical, it's not just the temporal, that is using finance, it's also the systematic stealing. So you have a stalling, a shifting of the problem. You shift it around, you stall it, you pay later, you use credit, and you consume now. So you're stalling and you're stealing. That is the accumulation by dispossession. I think our analysis of the current conjuncture has to do those things. It has to be as broad as the conditions demand. And I don't think, where Radica and I make some distinctions in our work, hers very fine-tuned at the level of geopolitical rivalry, because obviously when you get these tendencies, people form territorial blocks to defend against being pit with these different processes. So they sometimes labor aristocracy, as Lenin said, they would find common cause with their capitalists and do imperialism. That's fairly common. In South Africa, we sometimes have our trade unions do common cause with the regional sub-imperialism, sub-labor aristocracy doing sub-imperialism. So we see that problem. But I think the crucial thing is always to find the social struggles, the bottom-up class struggles combined with gender, sexual identity, race, disability rights, all of the youth, all of the struggles that we see going on against especially elites like the South African neoliberal nationalist elite, and also the accumulation crises that they get into. In other words, they're just overproducing. They can't sell a product. They need to move it out. The worst case is the Chinese going out. They've overproduced massively on the east coast of China in these very productive factories, very oppressed workers, and then they basically have a huge problem of what to do with this excess capacity, about 50% in things like steel and autos, and they've got electric vehicles and solar. Did I say overcapacity in electric vehicles and solar and batteries? We shouldn't talk in those terms, because we need everybody to have solar panels and batteries and things. So obviously the term overcapacity has to be put into a social context. But let's say that the difference that I would have with some of the people who promote BRICS as a strategic anti-imperial force, I would say no. If I look at it adding accumulation processes and social struggles, which they don't often, then I would say, okay, this is not anti-imperial, it's sub-imperial, because they're fitting into the broader system and they're actually in many ways amplifying it.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, so let's stay on BRICS. I watched you give a talk about it, and I read this chapter from your forthcoming book, which was really, really good. And I have it here in front of me, I think, but you identified sort of three different takes on it. Well,
it's the unipolar, multipolar, and non-polar problem, right? So maybe because neoliberalism, as you've asked, has been the ideology of the unipolar, that is the Western-centric, the multilateral institutions, let's name them. It's the IMF and World Bank as a financial wing. It's the WTO, World Trade Organization. And then there are a variety of others that add in, and I would emphasize the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, because UNFCCC has adopted two neoliberal formats of markets, that is carbon markets and emissions trading and offsets, plus technological fixes. And that's our term, ecological modernization. It's a technicist way. Sometimes it's termed climate action. People like Al Gore are famous for promoting a neoliberal version of climate policy, in which you get the prices right through market systems. The climate justice approach is very, very different, of course, so we can get into that. But the main point is that the unipolar, mainly the multilaterals I've named, plus the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council, the power that three Western countries, US, France, and Britain have, but Russia and China also permanent members. So there's a big debate. How do you get more permanent members, more balance there? But that unipolar argument, that the problem is that it's just under the Western control, could lead you in two directions. And the problem for BRICS, the problem that some like Vijay Prashad or Paulo Batista, Paulo was the Brazilian rep at the IMF and was the vice president of the BRICS New Development Bank. He's very sophisticated. And he'll tell you that if you take one road, which is simply ascension, inclusion into the unipolar system, you're not really getting multipolar politics. You're not really getting an alternative. You're simply getting an assimilation. And that's actually the story to date, that the buy-in of China, Russia, India, Brazil to the IMF through recapitalization. They needed more money in 2015. They got a huge amount from the BRICS. Well, then you're standing on somebody else's head as you move up that system. And the people that lost were the people of Nigeria and Venezuela. They lost 41% of their voting power, just as China increased by 37%. That's the assimilation approach to addressing unipolar politics. That is the West and its neoliberal agenda, traditionally meaning liberalized and big corporate and let interest rates float where they may and stop the capital controls and free up your trade and deregulate. The process that we know is the 1990s. Well, going back even to a guy I used to work for when I worked in the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, who let interest rates, he pushed them up to something like 18% at one point, caused the Third World Debt Crisis and financial liberalization and all that represented. That's different, I think, than the ideology of George W. Bush, the neoconservative, which was to expand U.S. military might and bring democracy. And then that's very different than the paleoconservative project of Donald Trump, led by ideologues such as Steve Bannon. And if you look at Marco Rubio as a classic neocon, right, a traditional U.S. empire expansions, he had to change his tone a bit, but he did bring Trump out of the paleocon, no war, xenophobic, isolationist, racist, sexist, all of his characteristics. But one of them had been, against wars, against U.S. empire. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., another example. They'll make an exception for that one. It's Israel. So the core sub-imperial ally in the Middle East, along with Saudi Arabia, is, of course, Israel. And that sub-imperial ally, which Robert F. Kennedy Jr. calls the, he's very proud to say we'll support Israel at any cost, and he kind of says, that's our tanker that we have, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's our aircraft carrier that we just keep there. And if we didn't have Israel, we'd have to put one there for all the oil. And that conflict that we could sort of see with maybe the Epstein controversy, where some of the MAGA people are stripping out because they don't like the East Coast elites, whether neocon or neolib, and then they find Trump may be pedophile alongside Epstein, so they're getting nervous. But it has been originally Steve Bannon versus Elon Musk, a classic neoliberal, chop, 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 right? And techno-feudalism, in other words, these big data lords fit easily as neoliberals, liberalize everything, libertarian in a sense. And I think if I take those as the three ideologies of power, Jay, what now we're looking at in the G20, which we're hosting in the city in a few weeks, we're looking at an incoherence that is still stunning to me, because the multipolar group, which is the BRICS, they want, if I'm saying in a very crude way, they want to be assimilated. They want to be drawn in. They want to become proper sub-imperial allies in the same system. That, I think, is happening. Nevertheless, but that's their walking right. But they're talking left. And the talking left is often about equality and sovereignty and all of the things they hate about the Western imperial project. So you do get an anti-imperial version of the multipolar vision, and it's best expressed through the Bandung, 1955, a non-aligned movement, and a little bit through a new international economic order in the 1970s and revival attempts. The problem is the vehicle for those wonderful attempts to genuinely have a multipolar, not just talk left, but walk left. The vehicle for that cannot be the BRICS. And the reason is that they have, over the years, become so emboldened by success within global capitalism. And I speak especially of the Chinese and Indians and the different ways that the Russians get emboldened, and a certain class here in South Africa, including black diamonds, as we're calling them, Cyril Ramaphosa amongst them, our leader. And that class doesn't have any interest in a genuine multipolarism. Their interests are in becoming more successful within the existing system. So in the global value chain, it's no surprise that the child labor in the Eastern DRC, that is, for example, embedded in my phone in the coltan and cobalt, goes to, out of the country, not through Kinshasa, the capital, where they pay taxes. It's just smuggled out over the border through Rwanda, And then over to the east coast of China, where Foxconn is brutalizing those workers. No trade unions. They have a hukou system of migrant labor where super exploitation occurs. That is, their family stays home in the rural areas by and large for as much as 28% of the workforce. And they're sitting in their Foxconn factory in their hostels and committing suicide. And the profits are going to Cupertino, California, for the Apple company that's taking in this global value chain most of the value. Now that to me is where we are at. And if you're talking that BRICS is somehow different, I'd like to see that class benefiting from this global value chain start to revolt. They might have started this week because Lula doesn't like the Jair Bolsonaro rationale for a 50% tariff, and nor does Modi like the rationale of buying cheap gas from Russia, which the US had encouraged him to do in the Biden regime. And in those ways, we might get a little bit of political resistance. But by and large, when you look at the BRICS resolutions in the Rio Declaration last month, in the Kazan Declaration last October, in the Johannesburg Santon Declaration here in 2023, you see again and again a reinforcement of the neoliberal assimilation-based sub-imperial BRICS instead of an anti-imperial BRICS. And I don't think that's going to change. I wish it would, but it just doesn't seem likely.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think I'm going to start, I always introduce everyone with like a little bit of my before thoughts, and I think I'm going to start with Bandung 1955. And I think you just laid it out well, that I think Vijay Prashad, a former guest of mine, can sense some of the same energy of that, but you're quite skeptical that we're seeing that it's a revival of anything that's is this a matter of trust for you? Or, I mean, you've also seen just the policies that BRICS is putting out or talking about are proving to you, it seems, that this is maybe just another neoliberal dragon that we'll have to slay later. It's, let's not get too excited. Is that fair?
Well, right, but Jay, people are slaying it now. The social struggles in a city like this one are formidable. I just yesterday, the Home Affairs, the sort of office that handles all our births and death and all of the sort of details, was burned down by 400 families who were being evicted from a neighboring building. And they were just so furious. Now, this is a protest that's fairly typical. Oh, that was extreme version, but the service delivery protests against a government that is chopping their electricity as a racist. It's a black government with a white-run electricity company at the crucial period during COVID, when they started chopping black townships because some of the people aren't paying. And if a high enough proportion don't pay, even if you've paid, you get disconnected. It's that durable racism that comes from the power structure here, as I say, that's exceptionally corrupt. Now, there we have so many social struggles, and labor struggles, environmental struggles. So it's not a future that we have to work for, where
we're doing
once we get to multipolarism, then we can fight the good fights for social justice and liberation. No, it's happening now, every day, every minute.
Yeah.
Our climate struggles are so intense that even today we've just won a major battle in the courts against the combination of Total, the French company, and Shell, plus a local ally named Johnny Copeland, who are intent on offshore drilling. And we've had hundreds of protests inland, but especially on the coastline, against offshore oil and gas drilling. And it's those struggles that, if you look at the BRICS as the major climate criminals, of course the West is, and Trump obviously is number one climate criminal. But when you see in the Belém, Brazil COP, that is the next conference of the parties of the UNFCCC, which is early November, just before the G20, I'm sure you're going to find lots of activists in Brazil protesting, for example, Petrobras drilling at the confluence of the Amazon River and the Atlantic Ocean, or Petrobras drilling offshore South Africa, part of the Total crew that now we're withstanding. So the first thing is, do you find any sympathy? And Vijay does, and he writes. The Tricontinent is always writing, but they can't make the leap. And if there's a Chinese company involved, often you don't see that critique, that same critique. If there's a critique of, for example, the worst corruption in this country has been partly Chinese finance, the Medupi coal-fired power plant, and partly a Japanese company, Hitachi, bribing the ruling party. Or the second biggest, which is Chinese locomotives for exporting coal, including coal to Israel. And that scandal involved China Development Bank financing the South China Rail. So all of those sorts of areas, Chinese investments in Africa, I think are being contested. A big Chinese copper company wrecked the biggest river, the Kafue River, in Zambia in February. Just spilt, I think it's 15 million tons of toxics, and it just wrecked that river. And again, I'd like us to be able to have the fluidity in social justice work, background research and writing, to be able to say, no, we'd call out an extremist BRICS company that does child labor in the Eastern DRC, or all the things that I could go on and on, especially Johannesburg company, just as much as we call out Western companies.
It's just that the enemy of my enemy is my friend fallacy is something you're really quite worried about. Like this thought of like, well, it's not America and the big bad evil empire from the West, so I have to support it or whatever. We should really caution ourselves for falling into that.
That's a crude way to put it. I mean, I'm not saying you're wrong. That for a number of people, including my own comrades, that I'm involved with all sorts of battles, the struggle for Palestinian rights, of course. Number one enemy is the axis of genocide of Washington and Ottawa and London and Brussels and Paris and Frankfurt and Berlin, and you could sort of say, that's the primary enemy. But I mean, if you look, as my friend Eric Toussaint from a Belgian group, cadtm.org, he just this week has put out the full BRICS analysis. That is how BRICS does not want to stop the genocide because it's extremely profitable for 9 out of the 10 former BRICS members, Iran, of course, being the exception. Now, when we get to my enemy's enemy is my friend, or there are other phrases used, campist, tanky, I'm not so much in favor of that phraseology, because I think there are a lot of really good people who can think beyond a simplistic way, but they would be, let's say, motivated by a vision of multipolarism because they hate Western power and the neoliberal or neoconservative ideology, and now the paleocon ideology, which is itself wrecking those multilateral institutions, provide enormous confusion for so many of them. Because if the U.S. is against the existing UNFCCC, which is what many of our best climate activists are fighting, okay, well, that makes it a very different situation where you have to actually defend UNFCCC. But I think the problem of how to characterize may be solved through the term multipolar. And then it allows us to get to the next question. But can we have a non-polar politics that's against the super exploitative conditions that you see in a sub-imperial layer like South Africa and the imperialist project in which the sub-imperialism fits? So that's what we're trying to elucidate. And issue after issue, Jay, it's very, very clear whether the two biggest movements of our time outside the US, which are climate and Palestine solidarity, it fits very clearly that there's an imperial West and a sub-imperial BRICS, with the exception again on Israel of Iran. And then we take the next wonderful question: how can the solidaristic forces within this emerging layer of countries tap into no kings and the big movement against the paleo-conservative, let me put it frankly, the proto-fascistic or authoritarian? And we're seeing that firsthand because in our next door country, Eswatini, suddenly we're getting deportees from the US and in South Sudan, and probably the 5 West African countries that just had audiences in the White House. And it's a lot of pressure on African countries to take these deportees now. El Salvador's full, right? So Haiti's full, go this side. Now, I think that's going to be one of our next big areas of struggle. That is finding solidaristic ways. So the clearest is you take one particular company and you punish it, and that company is called Tesla. Now, I can't boycott Tesla because we don't have any electric vehicles here in South Africa in spite of our sun, but we can boycott X.com, or we can do all sorts of things to start saying that the man who was raised here in Johannesburg and where he was so badly bullied, as he put it in an interview on 60 Minutes with Leslie Stahl, was bullied nearly to death. And the ways in which his high school bullying, the hazing process, turned a beautiful little boy, brilliant little kid, into such a monster, we certainly here in Johannesburg have to apologize for. But Jay, we did give you Trevor Noah, and there's a great young singer, Tyler, and we've given you Charlize Theron, a great actress. So, we're beginning to do the opposite.
I'm not holding any of that against you.
Yeah. But I think the biggest dilemma for us in that respect is this is a site, Johannesburg, that loved international solidaristic activity.
Yeah.
Gil Scott Herons, have you heard from Johannesburg? All of the systems and of connectivities that we've developed since the defeat of apartheid, which really needed exactly 40 years ago today, when on August 15, 1985, the Rubicon speech, that is the speech where the then president, P.W. Botha, he failed to cross the Rubicon, but he gave his speech this name.
I believe that we are today crossing the Rubicon in South Africa. There can be no turning back. South Africans' problems will be solved by South Africans and not by foreigners. We are not going to be deterred from doing what we think best, nor will we be forced into doing what we don't want to do.
And I just knew that this was a major disaster and that we would feel the negative impact almost immediately, and we did.
And because of that, we were protesting. I happened to be at that time in Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, but all over. We had these protests against the banks, and we said, get out of South Africa. Look, they're just not going to make the changes. And as a result, at the end of this month, in 1985, so 40 years ago, the defaults of this country, $13 billion, all its short-term debt, couldn't pay, closed the stock market, imposed exchange controls. These are extraordinary moments that then told white capital here, this white government can't be trusted. So effectively, our activism, because of the groundswell of protests, the states of emergency, the oppression, it enabled, like I hope we're all also conscious of, on Palestine, on climate, and an opportunity to cut a wedge in using boycott, divestment, sanctions. Certainly the Palestinians who work this terrain will tell you that victory in South Africa, because the white capitalists were wedged. That is, one part went here. They went to Zambia to go and look for the African National Congress, Oliver Tambo, Chris Hani, Thabo Mbeki, Mac Maharaj, Paulo Jordan, the greats of our period of struggle. And white capital went there and started this transition process. So we did get, in spite of accusations of Mandela selling out, I wouldn't make that case politically, although economically it's very different, but politically we did get one person, one vote in a unitary state. That is, it wasn't a state carved into different things. It could, from the river to the sea, we did get freedom here as a unitary liberal democracy. And that is something that we can say was internationalism. And I always seek that when I think the tactics that worked, that I learned from as part of in BDS, were picked up by, for example, Bill McKibben and his team, right? The 350.org and Divest Invest. At one point, they had $60 trillion of U.S. mutual funds, investments, unit trusts, stock market funds, committed not to invest in fossil fuels. And then the Israel BDS movement that we've been building is having some important positive impacts. Of course, the biggest thing is to get our countries to stop sending, in our case, coal and probably bullets. We haven't confirmed it, but we're very worried. And in your case, in the U.S., everything. So that is obviously the struggle with BDS.
Yeah, let's
We're
talk.
happy that 40 years ago we proved that in South Africa you could have an effective BDS that chopped right into the heart of white power.
Yeah, I think for people who haven't been as close to the Palestine issue and cause as maybe you have or I have in some ways, they're surprised when I traveled in the West Bank. At every intellectual student there wants to become an international lawyer. It's like that they're trying to fight for their freedom through that. And, half of their education is studying movements like South Africa, which they deem a success in certain degrees to figure out the tactics. And then also failures. They, the Native American case, and, they digest these things because they're laser focused on trying to fight for their liberation. Let's talk about it first in relation to BRICS, because I think for so many people, Palestine and Israel and what we've seen over the last couple of years again, plenty of newcomers to the conversation, have been exposed, and maybe they're doing their history homework and discovering that this is a very old hypocrisy, but they're being hit in the face with a massive amount of moral hypocrisy, which is, I think, the first thing that gets you when you look at your phone and you say, I don't know why this is happening, but I don't support it, and I don't believe any politician who's going to speak around it. But then they're, understanding. I mean, I think there's other layers to then understand, right? Like that's the first step into the door of why this is happening. And I want to put this on your table because, in my dive into all of the histories, I've been quite interested in I guess they call the revolutionary violence period in the early 70s of the Palestinian movement with like the PFLP. And this is where a lot of the plane hijackings and Munich Olympics and all these things kind of started happening. And when you watch all of the interviews, I mean, the walls are plastered with posters of Marx and Lenin and Castro and leftist movements around the world. Can you explain sort of why that is? We could talk about whether it was a tactically smart thing to align themselves with, but what that energy is. And I also put this one, sorry, I know this is a long question, I put this one to Radhika as well, but I wanted to ask, in what ways is the genocide in Gaza and what's happening in the West Bank, in what ways is that an imperialist or capitalist war? Does that question make sense? Because I think the Palestinians themselves, at least in the 70s and early, certainly saw it as such.
Oh, yes. And because, again, there was a big I imperialism, and it was clearly the West.
Big I, yeah.
Yeah, right from 1948, the certain factions of power internationally would say, okay, so we'll make Israel our project, we'll give them support. 1967 was a crucial sort of test of that. And then in, I think that revolutionary era in the 60s and 70s, especially where Palestine and South Africa, Ireland, a few countries were sort of fusing. There were cadres trained to fight in Libya, in Eastern Europe and Soviet Union, a little bit in China. These were moments where, under some circumstances, you could see genuine revolutionary upsurges that threw out leaders. The problem, of course, was that the elites learn, and then they make all kinds of, let's say the Oslo Accords in 1993 denuded the PLO of that potential to have a revolutionary military breakthrough. I must tell you, though, Jay, I think those that had promoted it, including somebody I admire enormously, Ronnie Kasrils, who works the Palestine frontier as much as anyone in this country, but was also a leader of our armed struggle for liberation with the African National Congress. Notwithstanding enormous admiration, I don't think they did more good than harm, because the harm, when you do an armed struggle that may be premature, you're unable to have the kind of mass strikes that Rosa Luxemburg would have advocated. You're unable to mobilize the base because it's so militarized. In all those ways, I would say we probably got a lot more traction on a liberation here from the mass protests inside and the international solidarity, the sanctions from the outside, and very little from MK, Mkhonto weSizwe, that is the army. They had a few dozen impressive attacks over the period, but it was also met by a repression of brutality, and allowed the regime in power, the Afrikaner National Party, to justify any kind of brutal violence. And that included around the region where the armed struggle was being based in. And that meant that the South African Defense Force, SADF, the army, was doing regular bombing raids and encouraged two wars next door in Angola, a group called UNITA, and in Mozambique with a group called RENAMO. And in each case, about 1 million civilians died. So there was a huge cost to the militarization of this process. Could you have separated the military from the boycott, divestment, sanctions that was so successful by 1985, and from the local struggles, trade unions, communities, women, youth, even the churches were very important? I don't know, but we can't look back historically and try to say, shouldn't have done that. But it does seem to me that the maturity of the BDS movement in Palestine and the ability of someone like an Omar Barghouti, who this week is celebrating 20 years of having organized the largest network of civil society groups And it was mainly in the West Bank, but I happened to have worked a little bit in Palestine in the early 2010s, including in Gaza, and week at a time sort of visits. And I could really feel that BDS had replaced as a moral force and a force identifying as you're looking for capitalist profiteering. Well, that brings us to maybe where in South Africa, just about 4 days from now, we will have a major protest against this government because it is allowing coal, 1.5 million tons of coal, to go from our main coal export site, Richards Bay, to Israel. And that fuels about 17.5% on any given day of the grid, the electricity grid that the IDF uses. And then we've got a few other very interesting small, let's say, campaigns. We're worried about a few arms dealers and this and that, and diamond dealers, and there's some retailers. So we do a BDS, but that attempt to stop coal has run into, I think, our addiction in our ruling class to fossil fuel. And I say that because it's the President Ramaphosa, so courageous in going to The Hague and giving permission for the Hague group to South Africa to co-chair with Colombia. They met about a month ago to say we will not let military fuel go. But then we've had 7 shipments, in fact 8 shipments this year of coal from South Africa to Israel. And the problem is that the main company we know doing this, Glencore, and its main ally is African Rainbow Minerals. And the owner of that is named Patrice Motsepe, and he's the brother-in-law of President Ramaphosa. And Ramaphosa's prior work running Shanduka Coal, he's a coal mining tycoon, was also hand in glove with Glencore. And Glencore, as you might know, is the most corrupt company, as even found in the United States courts, and huge fines there and in Britain, and works very closely with a man called Dan Gertler, an Israeli tycoon, notorious for looting the DRC. And in all these respects, we're kind of getting quite an education about the durability and the sub-imperial connections, because Glencore, you'd say, it's a big Switzerland commodities trading firm. Actually, its main base is Johannesburg, if you measure it by capital. It's about 44 billion British pounds worth on our Johannesburg Stock Exchange compared to 32 billion in its primary listing in London. So I think the more we protest, 2 big protests against Glencore last August, and then in May this year, the time of their annual meeting, and then against African Rainbow Minerals, Ramaphosa's brother-in-law's company, in April. So we were beginning to say, okay, we're hitting these companies as protesters, but it's the government. It's a man called Parks Tau who will tell you, and he's told in Parliament, we're not going to advocate coal boycott because that would go against the World Trade Organization's non-discrimination clause, as if there's a WTO we're talking about thanks to Trump. It's that level of frustration we have with the neoliberal mentality at the commanding heights of our state, connecting to this kind of,
I was just going to put a bow on that because it's so, that is such a good story. You sent me that thing on coal. I don't know if I could share it. Well, I guess everyone will see the protest, but it's such a good, simple summation, I think, of a lot of your grander ideas about imperialism and sub-imperialism and your skepticism, let's say, of BRICS, that this is sort of anything different. It is everyone sees the news. South Africa is the country that brings Israel to the ICJ, and they look all sort of high and mighty with this genocide case, and we see this solidarity and everything, and then you're pointing out, well, just scratch the surface, and is this just all talk? Is this all show? Is this all a theater? Like, really, where is the power invested in? And just how intertwined is this global financial neoliberal system or whatever that's preventing real change? It seems the global state of the psychological response to Israel is at a tipping point of like, we're tired of talk. We don't care how many speeches we give. We don't care how many condemnations you give. We want you to fucking do something or stop doing something. How many times have countries fought for these things and then discovered they're still sending stuff from the ports? I just wanted to just sort of underline what you said, because I think it's perfect. And that word you used a few times so people can track it intellectually, I think is so good, of sub-imperial, which is really, really good, the way you're, rather than sort of BRICS is something brand new. You're like, no, it's still in the same system, just sort of sub-imperial. Anyway, I really like what you said. It's just important.
Well, thanks. The flagging of the term and its tradition, independency theory, was something a group called the World Systems School emerged. They got it from a a great dependency theorist in Brazil, Rui Mauro Marini. And Marini was in exile, but he could see right after the coup in 1964, and his first use of the word in Monthly Review, a New York magazine, 1965, sub-imperialism, applied especially because the US had supported the coup and Brazilian capital had a problem. It had it's more unequal than South Africa at the time, and it was running out of its space, so it needed to expand in the region. And the super exploitation, that is, that they didn't pay their workers enough to even, tick over. You just let the workers die and get some new ones. The super exploitative system of a sub-imperial power, something he noticed was a justification for the overproduction locally that required a regional base. Eduardo Galeano spoke about the 1,000 faces of Brazilian sub-imperialism. And then it picked up within this world system school. Israel, Saudi Arabia, and especially white South Africa applied in the 1970s. A man called Emanuel Wallerstein helped to build our understanding. He died about 70 years ago, but was very happy to use the word, as did David Harvey in an analysis of this displacement of overaccumulation in his book, The New Imperialism, as did probably our finest African Marxist, Sam Moyo, before his death, to describe the way the BRICS had a certain schizophrenia where they would talk left and walk right. And so I find when I think about the different ways we can measure sub-imperialism, and I gave some talks in Brazil a couple of months ago to check this with sort of tradition, the dependency tradition. I'm still convinced that that BRICS and Lula's Brazil, South Africa, in the region here, and you'd have to kind of go through each of the practices and find occasional anti-imperial moments, like going to The Hague in January 2024. But then, it's just like you're saying, you get a lot of rhetoric, and rhetoric at The Hague was certainly painful for South Africa because it led to a lot of political pressure against this government from especially Donald Trump, but even from Biden. But I think the main thing is the two words that are used in Tel Aviv by Ben Gvir and Smotrich, the far right, that make Netanyahu way to the right of him. And they use two words when they hear from the International Court of Justice. The two words are Hague-Schmague. They just don't give a damn. They're just not going to pay attention to whatever's coming out. And I think, I hate to say these two words are being used in Pretoria, whispered, in the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, in the Department of Environment, in the Department of Energy, in the Department of Mineral Resources. We write letters to them all. The Department of Environment has a white minister. It's meant to be helping us decarbonize. All of them, and the presidency. First, they won't respond. And that's why we're having our first big protest against the government on this issue next week in 3 different cities, Pretoria, Durban, and Cape Town. And we expect them to at least acknowledge that there's a huge contradiction when they sign the Hague Group principles, no military fuel, no shipping, no docking, and then are happy to see 8 shiploads this year. So we're probably now replacing Colombia as the #1 coal supplier. And I fear that those two awful words are being used in Pretoria, Hague-Schmague, when they get our letters.
Wow. Let's talk about Hague-Schmague, because I was talking about that this morning actually with my wife, of the state of international law, whatever it is. I did a film about international law once, and it seems to me the collapse of legitimacy of it is for all to see at the moment. But the kind of thinker you are, I love this. It should just be the headline of why are we going for multipolar war or world or unipolar? We have to talk about non-polarity, and that's speaks to my anarchistic heart in a very powerful way. But this thing of international law post-World War II with the UN as being maybe a false promise or a promise that a lot of these BRICS countries at first thought would be their platform, their seat at the table in order to get this equality under the law kind of liberal tradition, as it were. How do you see that unfolding? Or in a non-polar world, would something replace it or emerge? I guess to be intellectual about the question, I'm kind of asking about the difference between globalism versus the internationalism of Marx in a sort of intellectual way, if that makes sense.
Mhm. Well, yeah, I mean, it's partly whether the globalization comes at you top down, it carries public policy like neoliberalism and free rein for multinational corporates, whether they're Western or BRICS. And the non-polar, that term, by the way, let me credit Bill Fletcher, who was an AFL-CIO leader, and he also led Trans-Africa. He's a clear socialist in the African-American community. And he would remind me, unipolar, multipolar, now we went non-polar, Patrick, never forget. And there's the epitome of a left internationalism. Another in the same spirit would have been Samir Amin, whose ideas, he was an Egyptian who spent his career in Dakar, Senegal. And he first worked in the UN system, but then became, as probably the leading Marxist in the continent's history, organizer of many social movement networks and intellectuals that were allied with left movements across the continent and then the world, Third World Forum. And he was therefore quite crucial before he passed away in 2018 of sort of networking the left in Africa. And his famous term, delinking, as he kept saying, this is not about being Albania in 50s, 60s, 70s, and it's not about being Burma before Aung San Suu Kyi got a little bit of power. It's not about being in North Korea, sort of completely everything autarkic. It's more an approach to looking at the circuits of capital internationally and how you can get out of them. So the one that I mentioned, where Treatment Action Campaign here, activists, people living with HIV, which are over 7 million people today and were then, and that was a death sentence, and the life expectancy had gone down to 52. And then we broke from the international circuits of capital, which was Big Pharma from the US, Glaxo, Wellcome, Merck and all, and got generic medicines produced locally. And you could make them in Harare or Kampala, Uganda. You could make these medicines with generic facilities, and you would then give them out free, not charge $10,000. The effect on that, Jay, just to finish that story, was to raise that life expectancy to 65 by the time of COVID, and now it's about 67 after the recovery. In other words, you can de-link from Big Pharma's control. What else do we want to immediately de-link from? I think not paying debts. So why would I say that? We have a fantastic movement that started over the last couple of years in Kenya called Gen Z. And the Gen Z movement has been one especially dedicated to questioning the government's fiscal policies, very tough new taxes, and then saying, well, do we really owe foreign lenders? Don't we need a debt audit? So once you look at the foreign debt, actually it shouldn't be 35 billion, maybe it should be half that or less than that. And then we can actually not have these tax increases. We can cover the climate damage from massive floods last year, or droughts the prior 2-3 years, locust invasions. And we could actually come to grips with being in the world as an honorary defaulter because we've done a debt audit. And so you'd want to de-link, as Samir would have said, from the circuits of international financial capital, which, by the way, increasingly involve BRICS institutions, and especially the China Development Bank. But South Africa, our standard bank, where we're also protesting next week because of its ties across the region. And those are the connections that the masses from below should make to break their elites' allegiances to the circuits of capital that underdeveloped. That's a simple message about how you'd go forward with that multi-scalar consciousness. So you want a globalization from below and a deglobalization from above. In other words, you deglobalize capital. That means extreme capital controls. We're so fed up of illicit financial flows, of transfer pricing, of all the sneaky ways that big corporates, according to the Treasury, our finance ministry says, to 7% of GDP a year is looted. And you can tell the people doing it by the color of their skins, right? Although Ramaphosa himself did it quite a bit, which he had sent some emails that, goaded the police into killing 34 workers in the platinum mines of Lonmin. He was the main owner, but he'd also facilitated massive offshore flows to Bermuda, just so you have a sense of it.
Yeah.
Hundreds of millions of dollars, so that in Bermuda, 2 people could work in marketing. And of course, it was a tax haven, offshore financial, kind of gimmick. And that's the sort of thing that we'd again need to say if we had power somewhere. immediately capital controls to de-link from the circuits of very parasitical financial flows. We could go, one after the other. I think the Chinese have done very well at the de-linking from global big data. Of course, they have their own big data, and I would argue their social, and it's called, I just remembered their name for where they surveil everybody. And you can watch a version of this in it's called Black Mirror, the series.
Oh, yeah,
and it's called
yeah.
Nosedive, and you kind of see what happens when everyone's rating each other. So this sort of social
The
control,
social credit score, yeah,
exactly. So if you see a state using big data in that way, you've got to be very careful. But what China did, to their credit, they banned cybercurrency, and I think that's a very good thing, to ban something that undermines monetary sovereignty. I know in your anarchist community, you've got some diverse views about whether cryptocurrencies might undermine the power of the Fed.
Yeah, I could give you my take. It's completely polluted at this point. There's nothing wrong with the technology. We could do an orange pill thing another time.
Except the energy consumption. Yeah.
Except the energy consumption is true. Yeah, there are certainly technical problems with it, but it's not going to graduate into a currency, which is of course was maybe an intentional move. But anyway, that's a separate conversation. I do want to finish and talk more about Gaza because I love the way you speak from sort of, it's going to be a lot of fun to cover this with a ton of the references that you've had and a lot of the people. And I always appreciate someone who gives credit to intellectual ideas. Actually, it's quite good. But I think some listeners or viewers can get frustrated by maybe the academia of some of it, and they just want action. Clearly, you're going to be on the street next week, so there's action. How do we end the genocide? How do we end the genocide? How fast can it be ended? Are we lost in our own heads thinking about Marx and thinking about global capital and all these things when people are like, I just need the bombs to stop falling now?
Oh, I totally appreciate that. And then identifying where the bombs are and actually going in. And Palestine action in Britain has just impressed us so much by just going right to those bombers and trying to disable them, or at least symbolically, labeling them. I think they're doing that more and more, so that the unveiling of Keir Starmer as someone who's so authoritarian and Zionist that he will lock up 500 people in a day a couple of weeks ago to just because they were showing their support for a banned group, whereas the genocide facilitation goes on. So we need to keep that. I want to add, though, to that axis of genocide, the West, the things that can be done. Because, look, if I were in Russia, I would probably be in jail. My dear friend Boris Kagarlitsky is serving 5 years for having told a joke about a cat at the time that a bridge from Crimea to the mainland was bombed. And he was kind of caught up in a Telegram account post and then put in jail. Obviously, some of these BRICS countries, you just can't talk openly. But I would say to Russians, why are 2 million of your citizens in Israel, according to Putin, protected by the Russian constitution and then supporting the IDF, right? That's 2 million out of the 7.2 million Jewish Israelis. And why is Russia supplying so much oil and gas and coal? And the second main oil supply comes from Russia. It starts in Kazakhstan and it goes through a Russian port. And the Chinese, again, I'd be in jail, but I would say, I'll be in China soon. I'll say, what are those drones doing? What did that drone? It's not just the bombing from above, is it? It's the 2,000 or 500 kg US bombs. It's those drones. The one that led the bombers to kill Yahya Sinwar. That was a DJI drone. DJI is the Chinese drone company. There's thousands of DJI drones. I was listening to Electronic Intifada yesterday, and it broke my heart that a beautiful song was sung by a Palestinian music teacher with his kids around him to the tune of a drone.
I miss you a lot, really. Today there's a lot of drones. I'm gonna sing a song today with drone. شيل شيل يا جمالي شيل يا حوطك بالله دم الشهيد معطر بالهيل ليل يا ليلو ويل ويل عالظالمي وينه من الله لا أسهر على نجوم الليل أنا ناديله شيل يا زمالي شيل يا حوطك بالله دم الشهيد معطر بالليل يا ليل ويل عالظالمي ويل من الله لا أسهر على نجوم الليل أنا ناديله شيل يا زمالي شيل يا حوطك بالله دم الشهيد معطر بالليل يا ليل ويل عالظالمي ويل من الله لا أسهر على نجوم الليل أنا ناديله شيل يا زمالي شيل يا حوطك بالله دم الشهيد معطر بالليل يا ليل ويل عالظالمي ويل من الله لا أسهر على نجوم الليل أنا ناديله.
Retail drone that's being used to surveil and also now to deliver weapons. $20 billion of trade a year. And all the BRICS are actually increasing their trade, again, with the exception of Iran, all of them. The Indonesian, since we're talking about Bandung, is actually increasing trade with Israel the fastest, right? That's the biggest Muslim country. Now, those relationships, I could go on because India has endless relationships. But Brazil, there was a big movement in Brazil and a protest at the BRICS summit in Rio because Brazil has 9% of the oil supply from Petrobras. And they also have contracts with Elbit, that's the main military company. There's a Johannesburg firm that gives an address to Elbit, not too far from here. We had a protest there in October 2023. Those are the sorts of relationships. And each one of the BRICS I could go through and provide more and more about. But Eric Toussaint at CADTM has just done so. And I think, we've just got to really amp it up now. And having just been last night at a vigil at Al Jazeera's office for the Alger journalists, half a dozen killed in just that one strike on the weekend. And having seen the potential, there were 300 people there, just called basically within 24 hours, the potential for getting out. Our protests in this city are often at the US consulate, but as I say, we're now at the companies and the South African government offices that are facilitating. So we have to step it up. Is there a way to do it that would really speed up? I mean, if there's some sort of ceasefire that is arranged by Trump and Netanyahu to facilitate an even more, let's say, durable dislocation of 2 million people, which is what it seems they're about to do in Gaza, and they probably want to do with millions more in the West Bank. If that's what they're about, then we need to go to those countries. And it looks like South Sudan may be one of them, and say, well, actually, that isn't the way to solve this problem. The horror of Donald Trump making massive profits from the Riviera on the Mediterranean, on the in Middle East, as he's articulated it with Jared Kushner, means we should never let them forget that phrase, that idea that they just want to clear out Gaza to make a luxury resort. I'm not giving anything new and different, but the fact that we've had 20 years of the BDS movement that Omar Barghouti and his team, the Boycott National Committee, began in 2005, this month, should inspire us. It took much more than 20 years for that to really click. It was more like 30 years before, 40 years ago today, BDS hit so hard in the financial sphere. So I feel that the crucial Achilles heel that some of us are working hard on here, and in Brazil, on oil, and in Colombia, they've just made finally a bit of a breakthrough there, I think. And then it's basically the energy system, and it links us to the climate movement and to our community movements against coal, which the slogan for the big protest next Thursday is for Palestine, for community, for climate. So those linkages are ways we're going to keep building more and more connectivities. And I think, the fact that there's a just energy transition partnership for South Africa that's gone nowhere yet means we should be demanding that any coal miner in the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa who might lose their job, if we can cut that Glencore and African Rainbow Mineral Supply, that's the main union at that complex, well, they should be hired immediately to do solar or climate proofing or something appropriate with all of that money, which comes actually from the axis of genocide powers in the EU. The US pulled out its $1 billion. I think I'm just saying, really, Jay, let's keep doing what we're doing, because I think we're on the right track to weakening Israel. The economy is going to be increasingly fragile. And let's think about the sorts of vulnerabilities like energy and of course military supplies. And it may be that we also move to financial relations and cut them out of SWIFT and cut them out of sort of, you go to your bank and you send money to Israel. Well, we should make that something that they'd be deeply ashamed by. I know you have an incredibly difficult macro environment. And I was talking at a conference this week, some visitors from US universities, and how terrified they are of raising their head now above the parapet, how universities are just under the thumb. And that's often where we get the strongest of these BDS kind of, these solidarity movements. But we have no choice. We might have to sacrifice some of these projects of our own in places like the US where you are. And I can only say that because in the US in the 1930s, with Franklin Roosevelt saying, if there are Jews in German universities, one of them my great uncle, Rudolf Heberle, who need to leave because you're about to be chopped, you can come to the New School or Brandeis or UCLA or USC. In my uncle's case, LSU, Louisiana State. And that spirit of opening up is one we're pushing our own University of Johannesburg to say, some of you may need exile, but we're really hoping you're no kings, and all of the struggles that I keep seeing in the US. Are such a fan of democracy now, and also of your work, Jay. So keep reporting from the front.
I have one more. I do have to actually, maybe you'll be ashamed of me now. I don't live in the U.S. anymore. I'm in Spain, but I am a U.S. citizen. So I'm fighting my own fight from different grounds at the moment.
Well, Spain has been one of the leaders as Spanish dock workers. Wow. Really
and Spain has, I think, a lot of the same hypocrisy issues, though, as South Africa, where there's a lot of talk and then people discover things. So it sounded very familiar. But I wanted to, maybe this is like fair or unfair. It was quite inspiring. But when I want to try to really do something here. This is going to be important to me to try to thread these needles. Is when you brought up Keir Starmer and you called him a Zionist, which I totally get, right? I totally understand. I've been trying to, I guess maybe with not that successfully in some of these last conversations, to try. I think it's true in action, right? Like his actions are Zionist, and Joe Biden said, "I'm a Zionist," and if Israel didn't exist, we would have to invent it for our interests, which is not quite Zionism as formulated. And I just want to put this one on your table. You could take Joe Biden or Keir Starmer with that kind of statement. Obviously, it walks like a Zionist, and it does things like a Zionist, and it talks like a Zionist. But I guess I'm trying to put on the table of, is it actually, they're so deep in the financial tie to the overarching, call it big I imperialism or literal imperialism, that Israel has wedged itself into that system as a very useful player. This is probably post-1967 with Kissinger, and how do we use Israel to sort of be a lever in the Middle East to keep the money flows going the way we want. For me, that's kind of my the thing I keep trying to put on the table for my audience, of wanting to help people understand in what ways a liberated Palestine or Iran or Saudi Arabia or whatever it is a threat to the status quo economic system of the West, and why this in some ways has become a monster that they don't know how to turn off without, I don't know, collapsing their own economy or something like that, which of course is no argument to persist with the immorality of genocide, but is slightly different than sort of like the religious Zionist true believers out there. Does that make sense? That was a weird question.
It does. I mean, there's a double problem for any left analysis, and it's partly the capital accumulation. I would look at Shir Havir or Jonathan Nitzan, Bichler. There's some great writers about the Israeli economy and how it connects in. I mean, there's obviously connectivities of enormous importance to surveillance systems and high tech, and of course military systems. It's a testing ground. But there's also a geopolitical and a territorial question, which is Israel's location in the proximity of so much oil. And then when you get both of those, and you find AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or Friends of Labor Friends of Israel in the UK, which could take down Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of that party so decisively. Then you've got such mixing of politics with these financial interests that it's hard to unravel them. And the way to do that traditionally, let's say the South African white connectivities to the US were in things like chrome, it was the most important supplier, and of course gold. And then you work the BDS and with increasing sophistication find out where those vulnerabilities are. And I think with the big geopolitical question of whether Israel, as someone like John Mearsheimer will argue, I think very persuasively, is doing far more harm than good. Perhaps the central contradiction in this most important imperialist, sub-imperialist connectivity, Washington to Tel Aviv, is the extent to which a MAGA far right that is isolationist in principle, seeing Israel wag the dog of the United States, will get increasingly frustrated. Whether you go into a sort of loop of Jeffrey Epstein being Mossad, as some would allege, I don't know if it's true or not, or that Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, was Mossad. Again, I don't know, but seems like it's a good hypothesis. And that you begin to say, okay, this is actually quite an important conspiracy. It's not one you write off. It's actually got some connectivities where Mossad is very effectively. We know that they can wreck the lives of international criminal court justices from all the evidence we've seen. We know that the extent to which that Israeli project will continue, perhaps for decades. So to me means, I don't know if the strategic sense that Gazans have right now is that they would accept a ceasefire in exchange for certain deals. Hamas is apparently ready to have some of those talks. Would those include a Palestinian state that would be Bantustan? And what Ben-Gvir is trying, as we speak, is to cut off East Jerusalem from the West Bank with another settlement. That's an extraordinary gesture of hostility. And to have three little Bantustans, tiny bit left of the West Bank, little bit of East Jerusalem and Gaza, under such pressure, isn't really a state. And then the big question, which was asked again and again in this country, should we accept Bantustans as stepping stones to genuine freedom? The Bantustans being about 9 different small pseudo-countries run by ethnic leaders who had sold out. Or should we say, no, we're not going to polish the chains of apartheid by accepting second-class statehood, Bantustans, where Africans would be, and then Indian and colored, the other black races here, would be in second-class parliament. And the discussion in the early 1980s, 1983, they made a choice in the United Democratic Front and the National Forum of Black Consciousness Group. No, we don't want to polish the chains of apartheid. That's Archbishop Tutu's phrase. We want to break the chains. And that means one person, one vote in a unitary state. So when I hear the term from the river to the sea, and I know that the Israelis are, going to make that as we don't have a right to exist. Of course, Israelis should have a right to exist. We all should as human beings. But should Israel as a state, a genocidal state, keep the same territory? I think that's a big open question, and whether we can push for something that goes far beyond Bantustanization of Palestine in this period just ahead of us, or it is a desperate survival tactic. What I think the people who promote the two-state solution will not acknowledge is that once the genocide of Palestinians stops, that is, there's some deal and Gaza is allowed to retain however many people, then it becomes a country that is subject to actual regular pounding in a more legitimate way than is currently occurring as an occupying force. That's the story that we're hearing, at least on the left in the solidarity movement, that it just won't work to accept the kind of compromise that seems to be emerging on the table. And that is especially the case if the Gazan communities of a couple of million people are dispersed, or a big chunk of them are forced to leave. It's a despairing moment. And all I can just say is think back 40 years ago today, when P.W. Botha shook his finger. We will not be influenced by foreigners. And the financial sanctions hit literally the next day. Chase Manhattan pulled out. There's a lovely film by Connie Field, who made Rosie the Riveter, if you've seen that film. And that film is called Have You Heard from Johannesburg? Bottom line. And it just goes through the panic of the ruling class after what happened 40 years ago today, financial chaos, because the bastards went way too far.
Yeah. Well, I'll let you go there. There was optimism and pessimism woven throughout all of it, but I think that there's an optimism in that final. It looks really, really bad until it breaks. Is I think what we're all hoping for.
Two last words.
Yeah,
which
go for it.
All your viewers, all your
Yeah.
loyal progressive internationalist viewers need to know the two words that resonate over the decades in South Africa. The meaning of these two words: power to the people, Mandela, away to. That's always something that warms my heart. And that's our
Beautiful
progressive
pronunciation.
juices.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was awesome.
Mandela.
Yeah,
Away to.
we're gonna need a lot of that courage, I think, to traverse the terrain. Okay, I don't have too many afterthoughts with Patrick Bond because I just loved the conversation and gave me quite a lot to think about. I think there's analogies and disanalogies to the situation in South Africa and what we're seeing in Palestine that are worth exploring, of just how much BDS can play a role or should play a role. I think this is an eternal question, as he briefly brought up somewhere, of wondering if you could sort of separate, let's call it the nonviolent BDS efforts, from sort of the more violent or revolutionary violence or armed struggle movements of the or actions of something like the ANC. That's an eternal conversation, I think, always, that probably a lot of us have had, including my next guest and former co-host, Coleman Hughes, who we are going to get into the weeds of our major disagreements on Palestine. I haven't talked to him in a long time. We used to live in the same city in New York, and we started the show together, and we kind of went our separate ways. And then October 7th happened, and I tried to engage with a lot of people, including him, and it didn't go that well in private. And I commend him for wanting to do this publicly and have this conversation. So I'm really hoping the next conversation is a really fruitful exchange of and exploration of our probably genuinely different approaches to philosophy and psychology, of how we even approach a question like how to morally analyze what's happening in Palestine. So we're going to do that. And I mentioned the thing about the ANC and BDS and how liberation movements seem to always have a mix of nonviolent and violent. And we're always stuck with this eternal question of Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or whatever. Because if you want to do a little pre-homework, one of my favorite episodes ever back when I was audio only was with Coleman and Chloe Valdery, where we did an episode called The Lessons of Black Panther, which is a lot about this same philosophical question of, on a personal level, fighting for liberation without falling into maybe hate and vengeance, or the dynamic of how a group fights for liberation or freedom and has to contend with the different factions who have different tastes and tolerances for violence or nonviolence, etc. All of those conversations, I think, are going to be incredibly relevant and to our next conversation. So anyway, as I say in all these, if you made it this far, you're surely a fan. Please give me a like and a subscribe. I have a ton of interviews lined up, and they're a lot of fun. And and then I also, this thing behind me is a record that I always play around with, like I mentioned, and has something to do with the conversation that I just had. So I'll let it fall into focus, and I'll say farewell and see you next time.